My name is Ryder Levesque, an HVAC engineer who survived the first 7 days of the zombie apocalypse. I was elbow deep in a hospital air handler when patient zero turned. Within hours, Denver fell into chaos. I escaped using service tunnels, maintenance passages, and technical knowledge that kept me alive while others died. Now I'm hunted by both the infected and the military who created them. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. I never thought I'd be making a video like this. If you told me a week ago that I'd be recording survival tips for a zombie apocalypse, I would have laughed in your face. But here we are. My name is Ryder Levesque, and or I guess I was, an industrial HVAC systems engineer. Not exactly the kind of job you'd think would prepare someone for the end of the world, right? Well, that's where you'd be wrong. I'm recording this for anyone who's still out there, still alive, still fighting. Maybe my story can help you survive. Maybe the things I learned, the things I saw, can make a difference. I don't know how much time I have before I need to move again, so I'll make this count. It started 7 days ago at Denver Memorial Hospital. I was there on what should have been a routine maintenance call. The facility manager, guy named Grayson, had called me in to upgrade the HVAC system for their new isolation ward on the 3rd floor. That detail still haunts me. A new isolation ward being rushed into service just days before everything went to hell. Should have been my first clue that something wasn't right. When I arrived that morning, I noticed there were more security guards than usual. Men and women in suits I'd never seen before, talking quietly in corners. The staff seemed on edge too. Nurses were whispering to each other, shooting nervous glances at certain rooms. But in my line of work, you learn to keep your head down and just do your job. Hospitals are always full of drama. While I was checking the blueprints in Grayson's office, I overheard 2 doctors in the hallway. They were arguing about something called a containment protocol for a unique pathogen. One of them, an older man with a thick gray mustache, kept saying they needed more time before accepting transfers. The other, a woman whose voice kept getting higher with each word, insisted they had no choice. The CDC had specifically designated Denver Memorial as the regional containment center. Something about our advanced air filtration systems, the very ones I had installed last year. Grayson came back before I could hear more. He rushed me up to the 3rd floor, practically jogging through the corridors. I remember thinking it was strange how he kept checking his watch. "Need this done by 3, he kept saying. "System has to be operational by 3. When I asked why the rush, he just shook his head. Orders from above. I got to work in the main mechanical room that serviced the isolation ward. It was a big job, installing additional filters, upgrading the negative pressure systems, recalibrating airflow. The kind of meticulous work that requires full concentration. I had my head inside an air handler, arms deep in the machinery, when I heard the first scream. It came through the ventilation shaft before it reached the hallway, a high, piercing sound that made me slam my head on the metal housing as I jerked back. By the time I untangled myself from the machinery, there were more screams, different voices, different pitches, all with the same tone of absolute terror. I stepped out into the hallway just in time to see Dr. Winters, the chief of medicine, stumbling toward the nurses' station. There was something wrong with the way he moved, jerky, uncoordinated. At first I thought he was having a stroke, but then he looked up, and I saw his eyes. They were clouded over, milky white with red veins spreading outward like cracks in glass. Blood dripped from his mouth, thick and dark. The nurse at the station stood up, called his name. He lunged at her faster than should have been possible for a man in his 60s. I watched in horror as he sank his teeth into her throat, tearing away flesh and sinew with inhuman strength. She didn't even have time to scream. I backed into the mechanical room and slammed the door shut. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely turn the lock. Through the small safety glass window, I watched as more hospital staff ran into the hallway, only to be attacked by Dr. Winters and now the nurse, who was somehow back on her feet despite the gaping wound in her neck. For a moment, I thought I was hallucinating. This couldn't be real. Things like this don't happen in real life. But the sounds, God, the sounds they made, those wet, hungry growls, were too visceral to be anything but real. I backed away from the door, trying to process what I'd just seen. My mind went to the worst zombie movies I'd watched. But this wasn't Hollywood. This was happening right in front of me. I needed to think, needed to figure out what to do. The mechanical room was my sanctuary. Most people don't realize how hospitals are built, how the walls are hollow, filled with ductwork and access passages that connect different sections. As the screams outside grew louder, I remembered the control panel for the building management system was in this room. I could access security cameras from there. I powered up the console and cycled through the feeds. What I saw made my blood run cold. The infection, whatever it was spreading through the hospital with impossible speed. In the ER, patients were attacking doctors. In pediatrics, things were happening that I refused to describe. Everywhere I looked, the same pattern. Someone would get bitten, collapse, and minutes later rise again with those same cloudy eyes. The security guards were trying to contain it, but they were failing. I watched one empty his entire clip into an infected orderly who just kept coming. Only when a shot hit directly between the eyes did the orderly finally drop. That was the moment I realized the rules from those zombie movies might actually apply here. Destroy the brain. I knew I couldn't stay in the mechanical room forever. Sooner or later, someone or something would break down that door. I needed to escape. But how? The hallways were death traps now. That's when my professional knowledge became my salvation. I pulled up the building schematics on the system. As the HVAC engineer who had retrofitted most of this hospital, I knew every maintenance tunnel, every service corridor, every access point that the average person wouldn't even notice. There was a service shaft behind the east wall of the mechanical room that connected to the basement level. From there, I could follow the utility tunnels to the parking garage, or even all the way to the adjacent medical office building if necessary. But first, I needed tools. I grabbed my heavy toolbox and emptied it of anything non-essential. Kept my voltmeter, wire cutters, heavy wrench, and screwdrivers, things that could double as weapons if needed. Added a flashlight, some electrical tape, wire, and a small first aid kit I found on the wall. What I didn't know then was how these simple tools would save my life multiple times in the coming days. I checked the security feeds one last time before leaving. The situation had deteriorated completely. The entire third floor was overrun. I could see military personnel in hazmat suits entering the building from the ground floor, but they were already too late. Whatever containment protocol they had planned had failed catastrophically. I removed the access panel to the service shaft with hands that wouldn't stop trembling. The sounds outside that door were getting worse. Not just screams anymore, but a horrible wet smacking that I knew was the sound of feeding. I kept thinking about Dr. Winters, a man I'd worked with for years, reduced to a monster in seconds. What could do that to a person? What kind of pathogen works that fast? The service shaft was tight, barely wider than my shoulders. It wasn't meant for human passage, just for running wiring and small ductwork between floors. But I didn't have a choice. I slipped into the darkness. My flashlight clamped between my teeth and began the slow descent. Every few feet, small ventilation grills offered glimpses into the rooms I was passing. What I saw through those grills will haunt me forever. patients strapped to beds, convulsing as the infection took hold. Medical staff huddled together in supply closets, whispering desperate prayers. Through one grill, I saw a security guard put his gun to his own head, rather than face what was coming through the door. I kept moving, trying not to make a sound. The shaft eventually opened into a larger maintenance tunnel in the basement level. These tunnels are the unseen arteries of any large building, carrying electricity, water, and air to every floor. Most people don't even know they exist, but to me, they were familiar territory. The basement was quieter, but not quiet enough. I could hear the shuffling footsteps of the infected even down here. I crouched behind a large air compressor as two orderlies lurched past. Their scrubs were soaked with blood, and one was missing an arm below the elbow, the white bone gleaming under the emergency lights. Yet they still moved, still hunted. I waited until they were gone, then made my way toward the parking garage connection. The door was locked, but the maintenance key on my ring opened it. I stepped through, thinking I was finally catching a break, when my flashlight beam landed on a scene from a nightmare. The parking garage had become a killing floor. Cars were smashed together where people had desperately tried to escape. Bodies were strewn everywhere, some moving, some mercifully still. The infected were feeding on the recently dead, their faces buried in open wounds. The air smelled like copper and gasoline. My truck was on the second level, but getting there meant crossing this hellscape. I stayed in the shadows, moving from concrete pillar to pillar. When I couldn't avoid detection any longer, I used what I'd learned upstairs. Noise attracts them. I took a set of keys from my pocket and threw them as far as I could toward the exit ramp. The infected looked up from their feeding, those milky eyes somehow still able to detect movement, and lurched toward the sound. I made it to the stairwell and took the steps two at a time, praying the heavy fire door would hold behind me. On the second level, things were marginally better. Fewer bodies, fewer infected. I spotted my truck just 30 yards away and felt a surge of hope. That hope died when I reached the main exit. The military had established a blockade. No one was getting out. I watched through my windshield as soldiers in hazmat suits turned away desperate families, even fired warning shots above the crowd that had gathered. Behind them, I could see flames rising from certain sections of the city. They were trying to contain this, whatever it was, but I could already tell they were failing. I abandoned my truck. It was useless now. But my motorcycle, I kept a dirt bike in a small storage unit just 3 blocks away. If I could reach it, I might have a chance to maneuver through the chaos that was unfolding. Cars would be stuck in the gridlock, but a bike could weave between abandoned vehicles. Getting out of the hospital complex on foot was more terrifying than anything I'd ever experienced. The streets were filling with the infected. They moved faster than I expected. Not the shambling zombies from old movies, but quick, driven by some terrible hunger. I stayed low, used parked cars as cover, and avoided main streets. The city was transforming before my eyes. Smoke billowed from multiple buildings. I could hear car alarms, gunshots, and the constant wail of distant sirens. Overhead, military helicopters circled, presumably looking for evacuation sites or monitoring the spread. I almost didn't make it to the storage unit. A group of the infected, I couldn't think of them as people anymore, cornered me in an alley. 5 of them, moving with that jerky, uncoordinated gait, but alarmingly fast. No way to outrun them, nowhere to climb. Then I remembered my tools. The heavy wrench in my belt became my lifeline. I took down the first one with a solid hit to the skull. The second grabbed my jacket, its cloudy eyes inches from mine, teeth snapping. I jammed my screwdriver up through its jaw and into its brain. The third got its hands around my throat before I could break free with a kick that would have broken a normal person's knee. It kept coming, They all did, until I'd used every tool in my belt. I stood there afterward, covered in blood that wasn't mine, shaking with adrenaline and fear. This was real. This was happening. And I had just killed 5 people who, hours ago, would have been regular Denver citizens going about their day. But they weren't people anymore. I had to keep telling myself that. Whatever this infection was, it had taken their humanity, kept their bodies moving, but erased everything else. I made it to the storage unit as the sun was starting to set. My bike was there, thank God, with half a tank of gas. I strapped my toolbox to the back and hit the streets just as darkness was falling. The night brought new terrors. Without streetlights, the power was already failing in sections. The infected were harder to spot until they were almost on top of you. I wove through abandoned cars, past burning buildings, trying to put distance between myself and the hospital that had become ground zero. Where was I going? I had no idea. A way seemed like the only plan that made sense. The highways would be death traps. Everyone would try to leave that way, creating perfect feeding grounds for the infected. Instead, I took back roads, moving deeper into the city rather than trying to escape it. My apartment was in a high-rise downtown. If I could reach it, I could gather more supplies, get a better view of the situation, maybe even find out if this was happening everywhere or just in Denver. As I rode, I kept trying my phone. Cell service was spotty, overloaded with millions of people trying to call loved ones all at once. Occasionally, I'd get a signal, see fragments of news alerts, emergency broadcasts. The words I caught weren't reassuring. Unknown pathogen. Martial law declared. Remain indoors. I finally got a clear signal just long enough to call my sister in Louisiana. She picked up on the first ring, voice tight with fear. She'd seen the news. Denver wasn't the only city. Reports were coming in from across the country. Seattle, Chicago, Atlanta, Boston. Whatever this was, it was everywhere. Get somewhere secure, I told her. Board up the windows, stockpile water. Don't trust anyone who looks sick. Ryder, what's happening? She asked, her voice breaking. The call dropped before I could answer. I tried calling back, but the networks were completely jammed now. That was the last contact I had with anyone outside Denver. I reached downtown as full dark settled over the city. The high-rises created urban canyons that channeled the sounds of chaos, screams, crashes, occasional gunfire. I abandoned my bike 3 blocks from my building when the engine noise started attracting too much attention. The rest of the way would be on foot. I remember looking up at the darkened skyscrapers, their silhouettes stark against the night sky. Behind some windows, flashlights moved like fireflies. Others showed flames. Most were simply dark, giving no hint whether safety or horror waited inside. My building was 20 stories of steel and glass with electronic keycard access and a security desk in the lobby. As I approached, I could see the lobby was intact but dark. The security guard was gone, the doors unlocked. Power was out, which meant the elevators wouldn't be working. 20 flights of stairs in the dark, with who knows what waiting on each landing. I stood across the street weighing my options when I noticed movement on the roof. A helicopter was landing, sleek, black, unmarked. Not military or medical. Someone with resources was making a very private evacuation. I watched as 5 figures rushed from the roof access door to the helicopter, which took off immediately, banking sharply to the east. That's when I realized. The wealthy and powerful already had their escape plans in motion. While the rest of us were being told to wait for help, to shelter in place, they were already gone. Whatever was happening, whoever was responsible, they'd made sure their own were taken care of first. I clutched my wrench tighter and headed for the service entrance. If I was going to survive this, I needed to start thinking like those people on the helicopter. Look out for myself, use every advantage, leave sentiment behind. Little did I know that getting to my apartment would be just the first challenge of many, and that what waited for me there would change everything I thought I knew about this outbreak. The service entrance to my building was secured with a simple padlock, no match for my bolt cutters. Every residential building has these hidden entrances, these service corridors that maintenance workers use. Most residents never even notice them, but for me, they were another lifeline. I slipped inside, locking the door behind me. The service stairwell was concrete and steel, dimly lit by emergency lights running on backup power. It smelled of dust and old paint, but at least it was quiet. No screams, no growls, no signs of the infected. I began the long climb to the 17th floor where my apartment was located. Every few flights, I'd stop to listen. Sometimes I'd hear noises from behind the doors leading to residential floors, crying, furniture being moved, occasional shouts, life continuing, people trying to adapt to what was happening. On the 9th floor, I heard something different, the unmistakable sounds of feeding. I moved past that door as quickly and quietly as possible. The climb felt endless in the dim emergency lighting. My legs burned, my lungs strained for air, but I kept pushing. Finally, I reached the 17th floor. I pressed my ear against the door, listening intently. Nothing. I eased it open and peered into the hallway. The corridor was dark except for the faint glow coming from beneath a few apartment doors. I moved silently, counting doors until I reached mine. My hand shook as I fumbled with my keys. The lock clicked, louder than it had any right to be in the silent hallway, and I slipped inside. My apartment was exactly as I'd left it that morning, a lifetime ago. The morning sunlight I'd expected to return to had been replaced by the eerie glow of the city burning below. I secured the door, pushing my heavy bookcase in front of it for good measure. Only then did I allow myself to breathe. The power was out, but I'd always been prepared for emergencies. Colorado winters can be brutal, and power outages happen. I found my emergency lantern and turned it on, keeping the setting low to avoid attracting attention from outside. Then I moved to the windows. From 17 stories up, I could see the scope of what was happening. Fires burned throughout the city. The hospital where this all started was now completely engulfed in flames. A containment measure, I guessed. Military vehicles moved through certain streets in formation. Helicopters still circled, their searchlights cutting through the darkness. And everywhere, the infected moved in groups, drawn to any signs of normal human activity. I watched as they converged on a convenience store where the lights were still on, swarming a small group of people who'd been gathering supplies. It was over in seconds. The infected moved with terrible purpose, working together almost like a hive mind, though each individual moved with that same jerky, uncoordinated motion I'd seen at the hospital. I turned away from the window, unable to watch anymore. I needed to make a plan, to gather supplies. My apartment had food to last maybe a week if I rationed carefully. Water would be a bigger issue if the utilities failed. I filled every container I could find, pots, bottles, even my bathtub. My emergency radio was the next priority. I turned it on, keeping the volume low, and searched for information. Most stations were static, but I finally found an emergency broadcast. The details were sparse and clinical. An unknown pathogen of unprecedented virulence had been detected simultaneously in major cities across the country. Symptoms progressed from fever to aggression to death, followed by reanimation with hostile behavior. The military had established quarantine zones around affected areas. Citizens were ordered to remain indoors and await evacuation. But as I looked out at the chaos below, It was clear. There would be no evacuation. The infected were everywhere, their numbers growing by the hour. The quarantine wasn't to keep the infection contained until help could arrive. It was to prevent anyone from leaving, to write off the infected areas entirely. That's when my emergency radio picked up a different frequency, a civilian broadcast, someone operating a ham radio from somewhere in the city. The voice was tight with fear, but determined to share information. "The military is pulling out," the voice said. "They've established a perimeter around the city, and they're not letting anyone through, infected or not. We've had reports of healthy people being shot trying to cross the perimeter. Whatever this is, they're willing to sacrifice the entire city to contain it." I switched off the radio, my mind racing. If we were being abandoned, survival would depend entirely on our own resources and knowledge. I had skills, practical, technical skills that most people lacked. I knew how buildings worked, how to maintain essential systems, how to improvise when necessary. Those skills made me valuable, but they also made me a target if the wrong people found out. I moved away from the windows and began gathering everything useful I could find. Tools, first aid supplies, my technical manuals and reference books, warm clothing, a small camping stove with fuel. Everything went into my largest backpack. I found my old motorcycle helmet and leather riding jacket, protection against both the elements and, potentially, bites. As I packed, I heard a sound from the hallway, a soft thump, then another. Someone or something was moving out there. I froze, listening intently. The thumps continued, moving from door to door. Then came a scratching sound, right outside my apartment. I held my breath, clutching a heavy wrench. The scratching continued, followed by a low moan that wasn't quite human anymore. One of them had found its way to my floor. I stayed perfectly still, hoping it would move on. Minutes passed like hours. Finally, the sounds receded down the hallway. I exhaled slowly, my shirt soaked with cold sweat. I couldn't stay here. Even if my supplies would last, the infected would eventually find a way in. I needed somewhere more secure, somewhere with access to resources. I remembered something from my work, the central mechanical facility for downtown. A massive underground complex that housed backup generators, water pumps, and climate control systems for several city blocks of high-rises. Few people even knew it existed, and it had security measures to prevent unauthorized access. If I could reach it, I might have a secure base of operations with access to power and water, at least until the fuel ran out. But getting there would mean crossing several blocks of infected territory in the dark. I moved back to the window, studying the streets below, looking for a pattern to their movements. They seemed drawn to noise and light, congregating quickly whenever a car alarm sounded or when lights came on in a building. But they also seemed to mill about aimlessly when there was no stimulus, almost like they were waiting for instructions. That was when I noticed something odd. A group of the infected had formed a perimeter around a nondescript office building 3 blocks away. They weren't trying to get in. They were arranged in an orderly formation, almost like guards. And they remained perfectly still, unlike the others who constantly shifted and moved. As I watched, a black SUV with darkened windows pulled up to the building. The infected parted, allowing it through, then closed ranks again. Someone was controlling them. Someone was using them. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just a pathogen that turned people into mindless zombies. This was something far more calculated, far more sinister. And suddenly, the new isolation ward at the hospital, the military presence before the outbreak, the immediate containment protocol, it all made a horrible kind of sense. This wasn't an accident. This was engineered. I backed away from the window, mind reeling. I needed to get out of the city, but more than that, I needed to understand what was happening. And the hospital records might hold the answers. The hospital that was now a burning inferno. But there was another place, the administrative offices in the medical building adjacent to the hospital. They would have backup copies of patient records, research data, everything. If I could get there, if I could find proof of what I was suspecting, maybe I could make a difference. Maybe I could stop this from happening elsewhere. First, though, I needed to survive the night. I moved my mattress away from the windows and created a small, secure space in my walk-in closet. With the door closed, no light would escape, and the small space would be easier to keep warm as the night grew colder. As I settled in for what would be the longest night of my life, I checked my watch. It had been just 12 hours since Patient Zero had turned in front of me. 12 hours, and civilization was already crumbling. What would the world look like after 7 days? Would there even be a world left to save? I dozed fitfully, waking at every sound, the heavy wrench never leaving my hand. Outside, Denver burned, and the infected claimed the streets. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new horrors. But it would also bring daylight, and with it, a chance to move, to act, to fight back against whatever this really was. What I didn't know then was that I wasn't just running from monsters. I was running toward a truth that would make the monsters seem merciful by comparison. I woke to a changed world. Dawn light filtered through the blinds, casting striped shadows across my apartment. For a moment, I almost convinced myself the previous day had been a nightmare. Then I heard it. The absence of normal city sounds. No traffic, no construction, no planes overhead. Just occasional distant screams and the constant thrum of military helicopters. I moved to the window, careful to stay behind the blinds. Denver looked like a war zone. Smoke still rose from multiple buildings. Cars were abandoned in the middle of streets. And the infected, there were so many more than the night before. They moved in groups, dozens strong, flowing through the streets like a grotesque parody of Rush Hour. But something had changed. They were more organized now, moving with purpose rather than milling around aimlessly. Some seemed to be patrolling, while others gathered around certain buildings. That same office building from last night still had its perimeter of guardians, standing unnaturally still compared to the others. I needed to understand what I was dealing with. These weren't mindless zombies from movies. They retained some intelligence, some ability to coordinate, and someone or something was directing them. The black SUV I'd seen last night suggested there were people who could move freely among them. People who might be responsible for all this. My apartment wouldn't be safe for long. I needed to gather supplies and move somewhere more defensible. But first, I watched the infected, studying their patterns. They reacted instantly to sound, heads snapping toward any noise with predatory focus. Movement caught their attention too, but not as reliably. And they seemed to have trouble looking up. Their gaze rarely lifted above ground level. That gave me an idea. The buildings in downtown Denver were connected by a network of skywalks and maintenance passages that most people never noticed. As an HVAC engineer, I'd worked in many of these buildings and knew their hidden arteries better than anyone. If I could access the maintenance scaffolding on the exterior of my building, I might be able to cross to the next structure without ever touching street level. I packed my supplies methodically. Food, water, tools, first aid kit, my technical manuals. Everything went into my backpack, with the heaviest items close to my back for better balance. I stripped the sheets from my bed and tied them into a secure rope, an old trick I'd learned rock climbing. It might come in handy if I needed to descend quickly. The motorcycle helmet and leather jacket would provide some protection against bites. I added thick work gloves and wrapped duct tape around my sleeves and pants legs. No exposed skin if I could help it. My heavy boots completed the makeshift armor. Getting to my motorcycle in the garage was the next priority. From my window, I could see the garage entrance was clear of infected, at least for the moment. But that could change in seconds. I needed a distraction. I found what I needed in my kitchen. An old cooking timer. Simple, mechanical, reliable. I set it for 5 minutes, then went to the apartment at the opposite end of my floor, which I knew was vacant. The lock was no match for my tools. I placed the timer inside, hidden under a pile of papers, then quickly retreated to my apartment. When the timer went off, the sharp ringing echoed through the floor. From my window, I watched as infected from the street below converged on the building, pinpointing the sound with uncanny accuracy. They poured into the main entrance, heading for the upper floors. This was my chance. I slipped into the hallway, moving toward the service stairs. The infected were mainly concentrated on the other side of the building, giving me a clear path. I descended as quickly and quietly as possible, my heavy wrench ready in case I encountered any stragglers. The garage was eerily silent. Most residents had fled during the initial chaos, leaving only a few vehicles. My motorcycle stood where I'd left it, a black Kawasaki that I'd modified over the years. I'd always been more comfortable with machines than people, a trait that might just keep me alive now. I secured my backpack to the bike and checked the fuel gauge, 3/4 full. Enough to get me across the city if necessary, but starting the engine would attract every infected within earshot. I needed another distraction. A car alarm would do it. I found a luxury sedan near the garage exit and used my tools to trigger its alarm system. The shrill wailing cut through the silence like a knife. Within seconds, I heard the infected responding, their moans rising in a horrifying chorus as they rushed toward the sound. I waited until they were fully engaged with the car, then pushed my motorcycle toward the exit ramp on the opposite side of the garage. Only when I was clear of the building did I risk starting the engine. The roars seemed deafening in the quiet city, but the infected were still distracted by the car alarm. I rode cautiously, keeping my speed low to minimize noise, staying on side streets and alleys. My destination was my storage unit 3 blocks away. I had equipment there that I'd need if I was going to make it to the hospital administrative building. The streets were an obstacle course of abandoned vehicles and debris. Occasionally, I'd see survivors, people hurrying between buildings with makeshift weapons, their faces tight with fear. We'd make brief eye contact, an acknowledgement of shared humanity before moving on. Everyone was on their own now. I was a block from the storage facility when I saw them, a group of infected surrounding a minivan. Inside, I could see movement, someone still alive. The infected were beating on the windows methodically, and the glass was starting to spider with cracks. Whoever was inside had minutes at most. I hesitated. Helping meant exposing myself to unnecessary risk. The smart move was to keep going, to focus on my own survival. But I couldn't. Not yet. I wasn't that far gone. I revved the motorcycle, drawing their attention, then sped down an alley. The infected followed, their movements faster and more coordinated than I expected. I led them on a winding chase through several blocks before doubling back toward my original destination. By the time I returned, the minivan was gone. Someone had escaped, at least for now. The storage facility was a low, utilitarian building with roll-up doors. Mine was on the end, partially hidden by dumpsters. I used my key to unlock it, then quickly rolled the motorcycle inside and closed the door behind me. The interior was dark until I switched on my lantern. This unit was my workshop, filled with tools, spare parts, and equipment I'd collected over the years. What I needed now was on the back wall, my communication gear. I'd been a ham radio enthusiast since college, building and modifying my own equipment. If anyone was coordinating survivors, if any information was being shared about what was happening, it would be on these frequencies. I set up the portable unit, connected the antenna, and began scanning bands. Most were dead air. A few had automated emergency broadcasts repeating the same useless instructions: stay indoors, await evacuation. But one frequency had actual voices, survivors like me, sharing information. I listened for nearly an hour, absorbing everything. The infection had spread far beyond Denver. Major cities across the country were experiencing the same chaos. The military had established quarantine zones but was struggling to maintain them as their own soldiers became infected. There were rumors of safe zones, mountain communities, isolated military installations, islands off the coast. There were also whispers of something worse, that this wasn't a natural outbreak. Multiple people reported seeing the infected respond to certain individuals, just as I had observed. Names were mentioned: government agencies, private research facilities. One name came up repeatedly: Threshold Biomedical, a defense contractor with a research facility just outside Denver. I knew that name. They had hired my company last year to upgrade the HVAC systems in their building, specifically to install advanced air filtration in what they called high-security research areas. At the time, I hadn't thought much about what kind of research needed that level of air containment. Now it seemed horribly obvious. I was making connections that sent chills down my spine. Threshold biomedical contracts with the government, the new isolation ward at Denver Memorial, the military presence before the outbreak, the infected who seemed to be guarding certain buildings. This wasn't just an outbreak. It was an operation that had gone wrong. Or maybe, more terrifyingly, gone right. I needed proof. I needed to get to those hospital records, to find patient 0, to understand what we were really dealing with. But first, I needed to eat, to rest, to prepare. I couldn't fight this if I collapsed from exhaustion. As I ate a protein bar from my supplies, I continued listening to the radio. A voice broke through, closer, stronger than the others. Someone broadcasting from within Denver. The message was clear and concise. A group of survivors had established a temporary safe zone in an apartment complex near Cherry Creek. They had food, water, medical supplies. They were welcoming others with useful skills. It was tempting. Safety in numbers, shared resources, human contact. But the voice mentioned something else that made my decision for me. One of their group was a researcher from Denver Memorial, someone who had been working with the first infected patients, someone who might have the answers I was seeking. I packed up the portable radio unit, gathered the additional tools I needed, and prepared to leave. The safe zone was in the opposite direction from the hospital, but if this researcher had information, it would be worth the detour. As I rolled up the storage door, I heard something that stopped me cold, the rhythmic thump of helicopter rotors, much closer than before. I stepped outside just in time to see a black military helicopter hovering over a building 2 blocks away. Soldiers in hazmat suits were rappelling down, weapons ready. They weren't evacuating survivors. They were hunting them. Whatever was happening, whatever had been unleashed in Denver, certain people were very determined to control the narrative. And I had a sinking feeling that anyone who knew too much was being systematically eliminated. I kick-started my motorcycle and pulled out of the storage facility, staying close to buildings to mask the sound. The safe zone would have to wait. I needed to get to those hospital records before the men in hazmat suits destroyed them, and anyone who had seen them. The city had transformed overnight, and I was beginning to understand why. This wasn't just an apocalypse, it was a cover-up. I kept to side streets and alleys, avoiding main roads where the infected congregated in larger numbers. The helicopter had moved on, but I could still hear it in the distance, a predatory drone hovering over the city. Whatever they were looking for, I didn't want to be spotted. My motorcycle's engine seemed impossibly loud in the quiet streets. Each corner I turned could reveal a horde of infected, or worse, the men in hazmat suits who seemed to be eliminating witnesses rather than helping survivors. I was halfway to the hospital administrative building when I heard something unexpected. Human voices. I cut the engine and coasted to a stop, listening. The voices were coming from a luxury apartment building to my right. Not panicked screams or calls for help, but regular conversation. People who weren't running or hiding. Curiosity got the better of me. I pushed my motorcycle into a nearby parking garage to hide it, then approached the building on foot. The main entrance was barricaded with furniture, but a side door stood ajar. I slipped inside, wrench in hand, ready for anything. The lobby was transformed into a makeshift command center. Maps covered the walls, marked with locations of infected concentrations, military checkpoints, supply caches. A group of people huddled around a table, talking quietly but urgently. They looked up as I entered, hands moving to improvised weapons. "I'm not infected," I said quickly, showing my empty hands. "I'm just looking for information." A tall woman with close-cropped gray hair stepped forward. She held an aluminum baseball bat with practiced ease. Information costs in this new world. What do you have to trade? I thought quickly. I'm an HVAC engineer. I know how to maintain generators, water systems, climate control, and I have a working motorcycle with half a tank of gas. Her expression changed. An engineer? With actual training? I nodded. Industrial systems. I was working at Denver Memorial when the outbreak started. That got everyone's attention. The woman introduced herself as Marion, former Army Corps of Engineers. The others were a mix of survivors who'd found each other during the chaos. A police officer, a doctor, a couple of college students, a bus driver. They'd established this building as a temporary safe zone, using the residents' supplies and Marion's military experience. "We've got power from the building's backup generator," Marion explained. "Water's still running, though pressure's getting lower. We're barricaded against the infected, but they're not our only problem." She pointed to the map. "Military units are sweeping the city sector by sector. They're not rescuing anyone. They're eliminating witnesses and collecting specimens." "Specimens?" I asked. The doctor, a young man named Eli, spoke up. "Infected individuals at different stages of transformation. I've observed them taking live subjects and recently turned ones. They're studying how the infection progresses." This confirmed my suspicions. It's not just a virus, is it? It's a weapon that got out of control. Marion gave me a measured look. "What makes you say that?" I explained what I'd seen. The infected who stood guard around certain buildings, the black SUV that passed safely among them, the military presence at the hospital before the outbreak. I installed the HVAC systems at Threshold Biomedical last year. Advanced air filtration, negative pressure rooms, the works. They said it was for high-security research areas. Eli's face went pale. Threshold was working with Denver Memorial on a classified project. I had colleagues who were pulled into it 6 months ago. They signed NDAs so strict they couldn't even tell their families what floor of the hospital they worked on. This was the confirmation I'd been looking for. I'm heading to the hospital administrative building to find records, to understand what we're dealing with. Marion shook her head. "Too dangerous. Military has been swarming that area since dawn." "Not for someone who knows the maintenance systems," I countered. "There are ways in that they won't know about." A heated discussion followed. Half the group thought I was crazy to go near the hospital zone. The other half believed the information could be crucial for survival. In the end, Marion made the call. "If you're determined to go, we won't stop you. But we need those engineering skills you mentioned. Help us secure our water supply before you leave. The pressure's dropping, which means either a main break or the pumping stations are failing." It was a fair request. I followed her to the basement where the building's water system connected to the city mains. The problem was obvious to someone with my training. A pressure regulator was failing, causing water to back up and leak. I could fix it with parts from my toolkit. As I worked, Marion watched me carefully. "You're good at this," she observed. "I've always understood systems better than people," I admitted. "Pipes and wires follow rules. They're predictable. Unlike whatever's happening out there," she gestured toward the ceiling. "You really think you'll find answers at the hospital?" I tightened the last fitting and tested the pressure. "I think someone needs to try. If this was engineered, if someone is controlling the infected, we need to know. Otherwise, we're fighting blind." When we returned upstairs, Eli approached with a folded piece of paper. "If you're going to the admin building, look for records on Project Threshold. That's what they called the collaboration between the hospital and the biomedical company. My colleague Robert Chen was the lead researcher. Find his files if you can." I pocketed the paper. "I will. What else can you tell me about the infected? I've noticed they're not all the same. Some seem more aware than others." Eli nodded grimly. "The pathogen affects different people differently. Some turn within minutes, completely feral. Others take hours and retain some cognitive function. But here's the strangest part. They all respond to certain stimuli. Specific sound frequencies seem to calm them. Certain people can walk among them without being attacked." "Like a behavioral trigger built into the pathogen," I suggested. "Exactly. Which is why I don't believe this was natural. Viruses don't include behavioral override protocols." Our conversation was interrupted by shouts from the lookout posted at the top floor. Everyone froze, listening. Then I heard it too, the rhythmic thump of helicopter rotors getting closer. "They sweep this sector every day around noon," Marion said. "Usually they just pass over." But the sound wasn't passing over. It was hovering directly above us. Dust fell from the ceiling as the building vibrated with the helicopter's presence. "They never stop here," someone whispered. "Why are they stopping now?" I had a sickening realization. My motorcycle. They might have spotted it and followed my trail here. Marion's eyes hardened. "If they come in here, we're all dead. You need to go. Lead them away from us." She was right. I'd endangered these people just by making contact. "The service exit in the basement," I said. "I can take the maintenance tunnels under the street to the next building." "Go," Marion ordered. "Find what you're looking for. If you make it back, we'll be here for another 48 hours. After that, we're moving to higher ground outside the city." I grabbed my backpack and headed for the stairs. Eli caught my arm before I left. "If you find anything about Project Threshold, anything at all, it could save lives. Not just here, but everywhere. This thing is spreading faster than they can contain it." The helicopter noise intensified. Through the windows, I caught a glimpse of men in hazmat suits rappelling down to the street level. "I'll find it," I promised, then raced for the basement. The service tunnel was narrow and damp, clearly not meant for human passage. I crawled through darkness, trying to keep my orientation as I moved away from the apartment building. Behind me, I heard the muffled sounds of the front door being breached, followed by shouted commands. I emerged in the basement of an office building a block away, covered in grime but undetected. From there, I made my way back to my motorcycle through a series of alleyways. The men in hazmat suits were focused on the apartment building, giving me a chance to slip away. As I kick-started the engine, I made a silent promise to Marion, Eli, and the others. I would find answers. I would learn who was responsible for this nightmare. And somehow, I would make it right. The hospital administrative building was 5 miles away, in a part of the city that first responders had abandoned to the infected. Getting there would be dangerous, but after what I'd just learned, I was more determined than ever. Whatever Project Threshold was, whatever had been unleashed in Denver, the truth was hidden in those records. And I was going to find it, even if I had to fight through a city of the walking dead to do so. I gunned the motorcycle engine and shot out of the parking garage, drawing the attention of nearby infected. Let them chase me. Let them try to stop me. I was no longer just running to survive. I was running toward answers, and nothing was going to stand in my way. The hospital complex loomed ahead, a sprawling collection of buildings partially obscured by smoke. The main hospital was still burning. Controlled demolition, I suspected, to destroy evidence. But the administrative building stood intact, a 5-story brick structure separated from the main hospital by a small courtyard. I abandoned my motorcycle 3 blocks away, hiding it in a delivery bay. The noise of the engine attracted too much attention, and I'd need stealth for what came next. On foot, I moved from cover to cover, using dumpsters, abandoned vehicles, and the rubble of collapsed storefronts to mask my approach. The infected were everywhere, more concentrated near the hospital than anywhere else I'd seen. They moved in large groups, dozens strong, with that same unsettling coordination I'd observed before. Some stood completely still, almost like sentries, while others patrolled in erratic patterns. Military presence was heavy, too. Soldiers in hazmat suits moved methodically through the buildings surrounding the hospital, emerging with containers and equipment. They weren't bothered by the infected. Further confirmation that some had control over these creatures. I needed a way in that avoided both threats. That's when I spotted it. A maintenance access for the underground utility tunnels that connected all the buildings in the medical complex. I'd helped install climate control systems in those tunnels 3 years ago. If the access point was still operational, it would lead me directly under the administrative building. Getting to the access point meant crossing 50 yards of exposed ground. I watched the patterns of the infected, noting when their attention seemed focused elsewhere. There was a rhythm to their movements, almost like they were responding to an unheard signal. I waited for the moment when the largest group turned away, then sprinted across the open space to the utility entrance. The access panel was locked, but the mechanism was simple, designed to keep out curious civilians, not determined engineers with a full toolkit. I had it open in seconds and slipped inside, pulling the panel closed behind me. The darkness was absolute. I switched on my flashlight, keeping the beam pointed downward to minimize the chance of it being spotted from outside. The utility tunnel was just as I remembered. Concrete walls housing pipes, cables, and ventilation ducts. The air was stale and damp, but mercifully free of the infected. I moved quickly, following the main conduit toward the administrative building, counting junction boxes to track my location. After about 10 minutes, I reached the access point for the admin building. The hatch above me would open into a maintenance closet on the ground floor. I pressed my ear against it, listening for any movement. Hearing nothing, I slowly turned the manual release and pushed the hatch open. The maintenance closet was dark and undisturbed. I climbed out, easing the hatch closed behind me. The room was filled with cleaning supplies and equipment, nothing useful for my purpose. I cracked the door open and peered into the hallway beyond. The administrative building was eerily quiet. Emergency lighting cast weak pools of illumination every 20 feet, leaving most of the corridor in shadow. No signs of infected, but no signs of recent human activity either. Papers littered the floor, chairs were overturned. A coffee cup lay shattered against a wall, evidence of a hasty evacuation. The records I needed would be on the 3rd floor, where patient data and research files were stored. I moved silently through the hallway, alert for any sound or movement. The stairwell door was unlocked. I entered cautiously, listening for echoes that might indicate somebody, or something, on the stairs. Ascending slowly, I stopped at each landing to check for threats. The second-floor landing window offered a view of the courtyard between buildings. What I saw there made me freeze. Military personnel were loading equipment into trucks, not standard army vehicles, but unmarked black transports with tinted windows. Among them stood a figure who wasn't wearing a hazmat suit, just a dark business suit. He was directing the operation, pointing to different buildings, giving orders that the soldiers obeyed without question. More concerning were the infected that formed a perimeter around the entire operation. They stood at attention, utterly still, facing outward as if on guard duty. I'd seen individual infected respond to certain people, but never organization on this scale. Whatever control mechanism existed, these people had mastered it. I continued to the third floor, moving with even greater caution. The records room would be at the end of the main corridor, a secure facility with electronic locks that required keycard access. Under normal circumstances, I'd have no way to bypass it. But power to the building was running on emergency generators, and security systems would be operating on minimal protocols. The corridor was clear, though signs of struggle were evident. Bloodstains on the walls, a handgun with its magazine emptied, a hazmat mask cracked and discarded. Someone had fought here, and recently. The records room door was ajar, the electronic lock disabled, its circuitry exposed. Someone had already broken in. I slipped inside, sweeping my flashlight across the space. Banks of filing cabinets lined the walls, and a central area housed computer workstations. The place had been ransacked. Files were scattered everywhere, drawers pulled out and dumped. Someone had been looking for specific information, and in a hurry. Had they found what I was seeking? I moved to the nearest workstation and tried the computer. To my surprise, it powered on, running on the emergency system. The login screen appeared, demanding credentials I didn't have. But there was another way. I opened my toolkit and removed a specialized drive I used for HVAC system diagnostics. With some modifications, it could bypass basic security protocols. As the computer processed my intrusion attempt, I searched the physical files that remained. Many cabinets were labeled by department, and I quickly located the section for research projects. The T drawer was empty. Everything related to Threshold had been removed. Not a good sign. My device beeped softly. I was in. The computer's file system appeared on screen, and I began searching for anything related to Project Threshold. Most files had been deleted, but they wouldn't be completely gone. Digital footprints always remain if you know where to look. I opened the recycle bin first. Nothing useful. Next, I checked the access logs, looking for recently opened files. There it was. A folder named TH Protocol had been accessed just hours ago, then deleted. I used recovery software from my diagnostic kit to retrieve the deleted files. The folder contained dozens of documents, research protocols, test results, subject intake forms. I didn't have time to read them all. I connected my portable drive and began copying everything I could find. While the files transferred, I scanned the most recently modified documents. What I found confirmed my worst fears. Project Threshold wasn't just about creating a pathogen. It was about creating a controllable pathogen. The virus was engineered to leave certain neural pathways intact, allowing infected subjects to respond to specific audio frequencies and chemical markers. In theory, they would become a controllable force. Soldiers who felt no pain, needed no supplies, and followed orders without question. But something had gone wrong. The pathogen had mutated, becoming more contagious than its creators intended. Containment had failed, and now they were trying to salvage what they could while eliminating evidence and witnesses. The file transfer completed just as I heard voices in the hallway. I disconnected my drive and powered down the computer, then slipped behind a tall filing cabinet. Two men in hazmat suits entered, sweeping the room with flashlights. "Someone's been in here," one said, pointing to the computer I'd just used. "It's still warm." "Check the whole room," the other ordered. "Director wants all intruders eliminated. No exceptions." I had seconds to make a decision. The air vent above me was large enough for access, part of the climate control system I'd helped install. Without hesitation, I removed the grill and pulled myself up into the ductwork, replacing the grill just as the flashlight beam passed over it. From my hiding place, I watched through the vent slats as they searched the room. They were thorough, checking behind every cabinet, under every desk. They weren't just military, they moved with the precision of special operations forces. "Room's clear," one finally reported into a radio. "But someone was definitely accessing files. Want us to check adjacent rooms?" A voice crackled back, too distorted for me to make out the words, but the tone was urgent. "Copy that," the soldier responded, proceeding to complete final sweep and demolition preparation. Demolition. They were going to destroy the building, just like they'd destroyed the hospital. Erase all evidence of what had happened here. The men left, and I waited several minutes to ensure they were gone before dropping back down to the floor. The portable drive in my pocket contained what might be the only surviving evidence of Project Threshold. I had what I came for, but now I needed to escape a building that was about to be demolished. The maintenance tunnels were my best option, but the men in hazmat suits would be watching all known exits. I needed another way out, something they wouldn't expect. I just needed those few seconds of chaos. What happened next would determine not just my survival, but whether the truth about Project Threshold would ever reach the outside world. I jumped for the electrical conduit as gunshots rang out behind me. My hands gripped the metal housing, my body dangling 15 stories above the ground. The soldiers were shouting, but their attention was divided between me and the surging horde of infected below. I pulled myself along the conduit, hand over hand, my backpack threatening to unbalance me with each movement. Halfway across, the conduit began to pull away from its mounting brackets. Metal groaned, screws popped loose from the concrete. I increased my pace, knowing I had seconds at most before the whole thing gave way. The far roof seemed impossibly distant, then suddenly within reach. I lunged forward as the conduit tore free, my upper body landing on the adjacent roof while my legs dangled over the edge. I scrambled up, rolling away from the edge just as bullets impacted where I'd been. The soldiers on the administrative building roof were firing at me, but their shots were hurried and inaccurate. Below, the wave of infected had reached the building. Screams echoed up as they overwhelmed the ground forces. The soldiers on the roof turned away from me, rushing back to the roof access door. They were trapped now, just as I had been moments before. I didn't wait to see their fate. I ran across the medical office roof to the access door and descended into the building. Unlike the administrative center, this building showed signs of heavy fighting. Bodies littered the hallways, some military, some civilian, some so badly mauled I couldn't tell what they had been. The infected had been through here already. Moving quietly, I made my way down to the ground floor. The building was eerily silent now, the infected having moved on to fresh targets. Outside, I could hear gunfire and the distinctive roar of the horde. Whatever had disrupted the control mechanism had turned this into a genuine zombie apocalypse scenario. Mindless aggression without direction or purpose. I needed transportation. My motorcycle was 3 blocks away, but the streets between here and there were teeming with infected. I needed another option. The loading dock at the rear of the building offered a possibility. Several abandoned vehicles, including a military Humvee with keys still in the ignition. I approached cautiously, checking for movement. The vehicle appeared intact. No obvious damage. The fuel gauge showed half a tank, more than enough to get clear of the immediate area. I started the engine, wincing at the noise, and pulled out of the loading bay. Driving through the chaos was like navigating a nightmare. Infected swarmed toward the sound of the engine. Military checkpoints fired at anything that moved. I kept off main roads, using service alleys and parking structures to make progress without attracting too much attention. My goal was to get back to Marion's group at the apartment building. They needed to know what I'd discovered, that this outbreak wasn't just a virus, but a weapon designed to create controllable soldiers. That someone had deliberately engineered this nightmare, and now they were trying to cover their tracks by eliminating witnesses and evidence. The streets became increasingly difficult to navigate as I moved deeper into the city. Abandoned vehicles blocked many routes, and fires had rendered others impassable. After nearly an hour of slow progress, I was still 5 blocks from the apartment complex. That's when I saw the convoy. 6 military vehicles moving in tight formation, heading west toward the mountains. Unlike the hazmat teams I'd encountered before, these were regular army. Standard uniforms, standard equipment. They weren't part of the containment operation. They were evacuating. I made a split-second decision. These might be the only military units not compromised by whatever conspiracy had created this outbreak. If I could make contact, show them the files I'd recovered, perhaps they could get the information to someone who could help. I accelerated, cutting across a park to intercept their route. The lead vehicle spotted me and slowed, weapons training on my approach. I stopped 30 yards away and raised my hands, showing I wasn't a threat. A soldier emerged from the second vehicle, an officer judging by the way the others deferred to him. He approached cautiously, rifle at the ready. "Identify yourself," he called when he was close enough to be heard without shouting. "Ryder Levesque, civilian," I replied. "I have critical information about the outbreak, evidence of what's really happening here." The officer's expression remained neutral, but I saw hesitation in his eyes. "What kind of evidence?" "Digital files from the hospital administrative building. Project Threshold. A bioweapon designed to create controllable infected. It backfired, and now they're eliminating witnesses." He studied me for a long moment, then nodded sharply. "Show me." I reached slowly into my pocket and removed the portable drive. The officer called over another soldier with a laptop. They connected my drive and began examining the files I'd recovered. Their expression shifted from skepticism to disbelief to grim acceptance as they read. "This is above my clearance level," the officer finally said. "Way above. But if it's legitimate, it explains why our unit was ordered to evacuate while the rest of the containment force stays behind." He looked at me with new respect. "You got this out yourself?" I nodded. "Engineer. I know the buildings, the systems. Found my way in through maintenance tunnels." The officer conferred briefly with his team, then turned back to me. "We're heading to Fort Carson. Joint Command Center has been established there. If you come with us, you can present this evidence directly to people who can do something about it." It was tempting. Safety, resources, the chance to get the truth to someone with the power to act on it. But I remembered Marion, Eli, and the others. Regular people trying to survive while forces beyond their control decided their fate. "I can't," I said. "There are survivors back in the city, people who helped me. I need to warn them, get them out if I can." The officer looked like he wanted to argue, but instead nodded. "Admirable. Foolish, but admirable." He reached into his vest and removed a small device, a satellite phone. "When you're ready to evacuate, call this number. Give them authentication code Echo 79. Tell them Captain Reeves sent you." I took the phone, tucking it securely in my pocket. What about the files? The officer held up a memory stick. Copied. We'll get them to command. If this is true, heads will roll. He hesitated, then added more quietly, For what it's worth, I don't think this came from the top. This has rogue operation written all over it. We parted ways, the convoy continuing west while I turned back toward the apartment complex. The exchange had given me hope. There were still good people in the system, people who would be horrified by what had been done here. If the files reached the right hands, perhaps this nightmare could be stopped before it spread further. The infected seemed to be congregating around the hospital complex now, drawn by the ongoing military operations there. The streets near the apartment building were eerily empty when I arrived. I abandoned the Humvee 2 blocks away, not wanting the noise to attract attention, and proceeded on foot. As I approached, I noticed something wrong. The barricades we'd constructed were damaged. The lookout position was empty. I entered cautiously through the side door, wrench in hand. The lobby command center was deserted. Maps still covered the walls, but the people were gone. Signs of a hurried evacuation were everywhere. Abandoned supplies, overturned furniture. I moved deeper into the building, checking each floor systematically. On the 3rd floor, I found Marion. She was crouched in a defensive position, shotgun aimed at the stairwell door. When she recognized me, she lowered the weapon, exhaustion evident in every line of her body. "You made it back," she said, voice rough. "Didn't expect to see you again." "What happened here?" I asked. "Where is everyone?" She gestured vaguely upward. "Roof. Helicopters coming for the last group. Military found us, not the ones in hazmat suits, different unit. Said they had orders to evacuate key personnel with useful skills." Her eyes found mine. "Said an engineer would be particularly valuable." "They're evacuating civilians?" I couldn't hide my surprise. Marion nodded. "Selected ones. Doctor, engineer, anyone with skills they need. Eli went with the first group to treat the wounded at some forward base. Left an hour ago." I should have felt relief, but something wasn't right. The military I encountered was evacuating too, heading to Fort Carson. But they didn't mention civilian pickups. Marion's expression hardened. "Different orders for different units, maybe. Or maybe someone's lying. Either way, helicopters coming in 20 minutes. Last chance to get out of this hellhole." I sat down heavily, mind racing. The documents I'd recovered mentioned asset recovery alongside containment protocols. Was this evacuation legitimate, or something more sinister? Were they saving skilled civilians, or collecting them for some darker purpose? "I found files," I told Marion. "Evidence this was engineered. A bioweapon called Project Threshold, designed to create controllable infected. It got out of hand, and now they're trying to cover it up." Marion absorbed this without visible surprise. "Makes sense. The infected we've observed don't behave like mindless zombies from the movies. They coordinate, they respond to certain stimuli. Someone's pulling their strings." "Not anymore," I said, describing the massive swarm I'd witnessed at the hospital complex. "Something disrupted the control mechanism. Now they're just attacking indiscriminately." She checked her watch. "If that helicopter's legitimate, we need to be on the roof in 15 minutes. If it's not, we need to be far away. Your call, engineer. You've seen more of what's happening than I have." It was the hardest decision I'd faced since the outbreak began. Trust the system that might have created this catastrophe, or take our chances in a city overrun with infected that no one controlled anymore? The satellite phone felt heavy in my pocket. The authentication code the officer had given me could get us legitimate evacuation if this helicopter proved suspicious. But to use it, we'd need to survive long enough to reach the extraction point. I looked at Marion's exhausted face, thought of Eli and the others who'd already boarded helicopters trusting they were being rescued. The right choice wasn't clear, but I had to make one, and that choice would determine whether we survived the next phase of this apocalypse or became just more casualties in a conspiracy that had already claimed thousands of lives. "We need to verify who's coming for us," I told Marion. "Let's get to the roof, but stay out of sight until we can confirm its legitimate evacuation." We gathered essential supplies, weapons, water, first aid kit, and made our way to the roof access. The helicopter wasn't visible yet, but we could hear it in the distance, growing closer. We positioned ourselves behind the rooftop mechanical housing, where we could observe without being immediately spotted. The aircraft appeared on the horizon, not a military helicopter, but a private one with no visible markings. It approached cautiously, circling the building once before descending toward the helipad. As it neared, I could see the pilot and one passenger in tactical gear, but not military uniforms. "That's not Army," Marion muttered. "Corporate security, maybe." The helicopter touched down, rotors still spinning. The passenger stepped out, a woman in her 40s wearing a dark suit under a tactical vest. She carried no visible weapons but moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to authority. "Remaining evacuees, please identify yourselves," she called out, voice carrying over the rotor noise. Marion and I exchanged glances. Something felt wrong. My instincts were screaming that this wasn't a rescue operation. "Stay here," I whispered to Marion. "If anything happens, get to the Humvee 2 blocks east. Keys are under the seat." Before she could object, I stepped out from our hiding place, hands visible but still near my tools. "Just two of us," I called back. "Who are you with?" The woman's expression remained neutral. "Threshold Biomedical Recovery Team. We're extracting essential personnel before final containment procedures." A chill ran through me. Threshold. The very company behind Project Threshold. This wasn't evacuation. It was cleanup. "Where did you take the first group?" I asked, stalling while trying to spot weapons or reinforcements. "They're safe at our facility outside the containment zone," she replied smoothly. "We need to leave immediately. The containment protocols enter final phase in 30 minutes. Final phase? The files I'd recovered mentioned a terminal containment solution if the infected couldn't be controlled. They were going to eliminate everything. Infected, witnesses, evidence, the entire city. "We'll need verification," I said, taking a step backward. "Some identification, confirmation of your evacuation authorization." The woman's expression hardened. "There's no time for bureaucracy. Either come with us now or remain for containment." From my peripheral vision, I saw Marion shifting position, shotgun ready. She'd reached the same conclusion I had. "I think we'll take our chances," I replied. The woman sighed as if disappointed. "Asset retrieval team, we have resistance. Proceed with involuntary extraction." Two men in tactical gear emerged from the helicopter, weapons raised. They hadn't been visible before, hidden in the rear compartment. One fired immediately, a dart striking the wall near my head. Tranquilizers, not bullets. They wanted us alive. Marion fired her shotgun, forcing them to duck back into the helicopter. I ran for the roof access door as bullets began to replace tranquilizer darts. We made it inside, slamming the door behind us and racing down the stairs. "What's the plan?" Marion asked as we descended. "Get to the Humvee. Use the satellite phone I got from the military convoy. They gave me an authentication code for extraction." We reached the ground floor and exited through a service door, emerging into an alley behind the building. The helicopter was repositioning, searchlight sweeping the surrounding streets. We stayed in shadows, moving from cover to cover until we reached the Humvee. As I'd instructed Marion, the keys were under the seat. We got inside and I started the engine just as the helicopter spotted us. Bullets pinged off the armored exterior as I accelerated away, weaving through abandoned vehicles. "They really want us," Marion observed grimly. "Or they really don't want whatever you found getting out." I pulled the satellite phone from my pocket. Let's find out what the real military has to say about this. I dialed the number Captain Reeves had given me, entering the authentication code when prompted. After a tense minute, a voice responded. "Authentication confirmed. State your situation and location." I explained rapidly, Threshold Biomedical's private forces attempting to capture us, the evidence I'd recovered, the mention of final containment protocols. The voice on the other end was silent for several seconds after I finished. "Proceed to Extraction Point Alpha. Coordinates are being sent to your device now. ETA 30 minutes. Be advised, we have confirmation of unauthorized detonation protocols initiated in your sector. The entire zone is scheduled for purification at midnight." The line went dead, and the phone displayed a map with coordinates. The extraction point was at a high school football field at the edge of the city, nearly 10 miles from our current position. "They're going to bomb the city," I told Marion. "Some kind of purification. We have less than 3 hours to reach the extraction point." Marion checked her weapon. "Then we better hurry." The journey through Denver's dying streets was a gauntlet of horror. The infected roamed in massive hordes now, completely directionless but incredibly aggressive. We were forced to detour repeatedly, sometimes backtracking for miles to find passable routes. Threshold's helicopter tracked us for the first few miles, taking occasional shots when we were exposed. They eventually broke off, presumably to refuel or pursue other targets. But the damage was done. The noise had attracted infected to our route, making progress even slower. An hour into our journey, with still more than half the distance to cover, we hit a complete roadblock. A tanker truck had overturned, spilling fuel across the intersection. The wreckage was surrounded by infected, drawn by the commotion of our approach. "We need another route," Marion said, scanning the map. I studied our surroundings. We were near the central business district, an area I knew well from my work. "There's an underground service tunnel for utilities about 2 blocks from here. It runs for nearly a mile in the direction we need to go." The entrance was in the basement of a bank building. We abandoned the Humvee, taking only essential supplies, and moved on foot. The infected were concentrated on the vehicle, giving us a narrow window to slip past them and into the building. The bank's interior was surprisingly untouched, evidence that the evacuation had happened so quickly that looting never took hold. We found the basement access and descended into darkness. My flashlight revealed the utility tunnel entrance, secured with a heavy padlock. "Allow me," I said, selecting the appropriate tools from my belt. The lock gave way after a minute of manipulation. The tunnel beyond was narrow but passable, concrete walls lined with pipes and conduits. "This should take us under the worst of the infected concentration," I explained as we entered. "These tunnels connect most of downtown. Service workers use them to move between buildings without going outside during winter." We made good progress for about half a mile before encountering our first obstacle, a section of collapsed ceiling blocking the main passage. Water trickled through the debris, suggesting a broken main above. "Is there another way?" Marion asked. I examined our options. "There's a junction about 100 yards back. We can take the secondary tunnel, though it'll add some distance." We backtracked and took the alternate route. The secondary tunnel was narrower, the ceiling lower, forcing us to crouch as we moved. After 20 minutes of uncomfortable progress, we reached an access point that, according to my mental map, should put us within 3 miles of the extraction point. We emerged into the basement of an office building. The silence was unnerving after the constant dripping and echoing of the tunnel. We moved cautiously toward the ground floor, weapons ready. The lobby was clear, but the glass front doors revealed a troubling scene outside. Military vehicles, not the regular army I'd encountered earlier, but the unmarked units associated with the containment operation, had established a checkpoint 1 block away. They were systematically checking buildings, presumably for survivors, or evidence to eliminate before the purification. "We can't go out the front," Marion whispered. "They'll spot us immediately." I considered our options. Service exit in the back, but we'll need a distraction to get past the checkpoint. Marion reached into her pack and removed a flare gun. "Will this do?" The plan was simple but risky. Marion would fire the flare into an abandoned building a few blocks in the opposite direction from our route. When the containment team investigated, we'd slip past their checkpoint and continue toward the extraction point. Marion took position at a second-floor window with a clear line of sight to our target, a partially collapsed department store. She fired the flare, which arced through the twilight sky before crashing through a broken window. Within seconds, the interior of the store was illuminated with bright red light. The reaction was immediate. 3 vehicles from the checkpoint raced toward the flare, leaving just 2 soldiers manning the barricade. We exited through the rear service door and circled wide around the checkpoint, using alleyways and side streets to remain undetected. Once clear, we increased our pace. The extraction point was still over 2 miles away and time was running short. The satellite phone showed less than an hour until the scheduled purification. Whatever form that took, we did not want to be in the city when it happened. As we moved through the darkening streets, I reflected on how quickly society had collapsed. Just 5 days ago, I had been an ordinary engineer doing an ordinary job. Now I was fleeing a zombie apocalypse with evidence of a government conspiracy, while the corporate creators of the disaster tried to hunt me down. If I survived to tell this story, would anyone even believe it? The high school came into view as full darkness settled over the city. The football field was surrounded by a high chain-link fence, with stadium lights on tall poles at each corner. None were illuminated. Power had failed across this section of the city days ago. "How will they find us in the dark?" Marion asked as we approached the fence. I removed the satellite phone. "I'm guessing they'll contact us when they're close." As if on cue, the device vibrated with an incoming message. "ETA 5 minutes. Illuminate extraction point if possible." The stadium had an emergency generator for power outages during games. If it was still operational, we could light the field for the approaching helicopter. The generator would be in a maintenance shed near the bleachers. We scaled the fence and crossed the darkened field to the shed. The padlock was no match for my tools. Inside, the generator appeared intact, with a half-full tank of diesel fuel. I checked the connections, primed the engine, and pulled the starter cord. After a few attempts, it roared to life. Marion found the lighting controls and activated 2 of the 4 stadium lights. The field was suddenly bathed in harsh illumination, a beacon in the darkness of the dead city. "Now we wait," I said, checking the time. 20 minutes until midnight. 20 minutes until whatever purification was planned. The distinctive thump of helicopter rotors reached us before we could see the aircraft. Then it appeared, a black shape against the night sky, approaching rapidly from the east. It bore military markings, not the unmarked helicopter that had pursued us earlier. As it descended toward the illuminated field, my relief was tempered by caution. After everything we'd seen, trust didn't come easily. The files I'd recovered showed layers of deception, agencies working against each other, corporate interests manipulating government response. Until we were safely away from Denver, I wouldn't believe we were truly being rescued. The helicopter touched down at the center of the field, rotors still spinning. A soldier in standard Army combat uniform jumped out and waved us forward. We approached cautiously, weapons still ready. "Captain Reeves sent you," I called over the engine noise. The soldier nodded. Authentication code Echo 79. We need to move now. Purification begins in 15 minutes. I looked at Marion, she nodded grimly, and we climbed aboard. As the helicopter lifted off, I looked down at the city that had been my home. From this height, with most areas dark and silent, it was hard to believe the horror that had unfolded there over the past 5 days. We banked sharply, accelerating away from Denver at maximum speed. The soldier handed us headsets so we could communicate over the engine noise. "What exactly is this purification?" I asked. He exchanged glances with the pilot before answering. "Thermal cleansing. High-temperature incendiary bombs followed by chemical agents. Nothing survives. Not the infected, not the evidence." "A cover-up," Marion said flatly. "Orders from somewhere," the soldier replied carefully. "Not through normal channels. Half the military doesn't know what the other half is doing right now." We were 10 miles from the city when it began. Even through the helicopter's insulated cabin, we felt the concussive force of the first explosions. Looking back, I saw bright flashes illuminating the skyline, followed by rising fireballs that merged into a wall of flame. Denver was being erased, along with everyone and everything left inside. The infected, yes, but also survivors who hadn't been essential enough to evacuate. Evidence of what had really happened. Proof of who was responsible. But not all the evidence. I patted my pocket, feeling the hard outline of the portable drive containing the project threshold files. Someone would be held accountable. Someone would have to answer for what they'd done. The helicopter continued west, toward the extraction point Captain Reeves had mentioned. Fort Carson would be crawling with military personnel, some involved in the containment operation, others possibly unaware of the true nature of the outbreak. Navigating that environment while protecting our evidence would require caution and strategy. "Where exactly are we going?" I asked the soldier. "Secure facility within Fort Carson," he replied. "Quarantine protocols will be in effect. You'll be debriefed by intelligence officers." Intelligence officers who might or might not be part of the conspiracy. We were trading one danger for another, but at least we'd escaped the dead city. For now, that would have to be enough. As Denver disappeared behind us, consumed by flames that reached into the night sky, I made a silent promise. The truth would come out. The people responsible would face justice. And if the infection had spread beyond Denver, as the radio report suggested, the knowledge I'd gathered might be the key to stopping it. Day 5 of the apocalypse was ending. What the 6th day would bring was still unknown, but for the first time since the outbreak began, I felt something close to hope. Not for a return to normal, that world was gone, but for the possibility of building something new from the ashes of what we'd lost. The truth about Project Threshold was safely in my possession. Now I just had to stay alive long enough to share it with the world. Fort Carson loomed ahead, a sprawling military complex illuminated by powerful floodlights. From the air, it looked like a fortress, concrete barriers, checkpoints, and armed personnel creating concentric rings of security. The helicopter circled once before descending toward a landing pad near the Central Command building. As we touched down, I noticed something concerning. The soldiers receiving us weren't regular army like our pilot and escort. They wore the same type of unmarked tactical gear I'd seen on the Threshold biomedical security forces. My hand tightened around the portable drive in my pocket. Marion noticed, too. She gave me a subtle nod toward the nearest building, a low structure that appeared to be a motor pool or maintenance facility. If things went wrong, that would be our escape route. We exited the helicopter, ducking under the still-spinning rotors. 4 soldiers approached, weapons held at ready positions, not quite aimed at us, but not pointed away either. "Survivors from Denver sector?" the lead soldier asked our escort. "Affirmative. High-value assets with critical intelligence." The leader nodded. We'll take them for processing and decontamination. Our escort hesitated. My orders are to deliver them directly to Captain Reeves. The leader's posture stiffened. Captain Reeves has been reassigned. These survivors fall under threshold containment protocols now. That was all I needed to hear. These weren't legitimate military. They were threshold security operating on a military base. The conspiracy went deeper than I'd imagined. I caught Marion's eye and gave an almost imperceptible nod toward the maintenance building. I need to use the restroom, I said loudly, hunching slightly as if in discomfort. Right now, please. The distraction worked. As attention focused on me, Marion drove her elbow into the nearest guard's throat. I tackled the leader using my heavy wrench to disable his radio. Our escort, momentarily stunned by the sudden violence, finally reacted by drawing his sidearm on the other threshold guards. Go, he shouted to us. Building B, Section 4. Reeves is there. We didn't wait to see how the confrontation played out. We sprinted for the maintenance building, alarms blaring behind us. Inside, we found what I'd hoped for. Vehicles, tools, potential weapons. A small security office provided a map of the base. Building B was on the opposite side of the complex, nearly a mile away. They'll lock down the whole base, Marion said, checking the windows for pursuit. We'll never make it on foot. I scanned the available vehicles. Most required keys we didn't have, but at the back of the garage sat a maintenance golf cart with keys in the ignition. Not fast, but maneuverable and quiet. Better than nothing, I said, jumping into the driver's seat. We exited through a rear service gate just as the first search teams reached the maintenance building. The golf cart's electric motor was nearly silent as we navigated between buildings, staying away from main roads and checkpoints. The base was in full alert now, searchlights sweeping across open areas, personnel rushing to assigned positions. The map showed a service road that ran behind the barracks area, connecting to Building B through a supply area. It would keep us away from the main security checkpoints, but we'd be exposed if aircraft joined the search. Halfway to our destination, disaster struck. A Humvee rounded the corner ahead, headlights illuminating our golf cart. The driver immediately radioed our position. We abandoned the vehicle and sprinted for the nearest cover, a drainage culvert running beneath the road. The concrete pipe was narrow and partially filled with stagnant water, but it offered concealment. We crawled through darkness, emerging on the other side just as search teams reached the abandoned golf cart. From our new position, Building B was visible about 300 yards away across an open parade ground. We'll never make it across that, Marion whispered. Too exposed. I studied the area, thinking like an engineer. Underground, I said, pointing to a maintenance access cover nearby. These bases have utility tunnels for steam pipes, electrical conduits, communications. They'll connect most major buildings. The access point was locked, but by now I was becoming an expert at defeating security measures. Inside, the utility tunnel was cramped but navigable. Pipes carrying steam for heating ran along one wall, while electrical conduits lined the other. The heat was intense, making breathing difficult as we moved deeper into the network. Using the base map I'd memorized, I navigated toward Building B. When we reached what should have been the access point, we found another problem. The hatch was electronically locked from the inside with no manual override. Now what? Marion asked, wiping sweat from her face. I examined the locking mechanism. Standard electromagnetic lock. Needs power to stay secure. I traced the power conduit back to a junction box, then used my tools to expose the wiring. A few careful cuts, and the lock disengaged with an audible click. We emerged into a supply closet in the basement of Building B. The facility appeared to be a command center of some kind. Maps covered walls, communications equipment hummed, and military personnel moved with purpose. But these weren't the unmarked tactical teams we'd encountered outside. These were regular Army, Air Force, even some civilian personnel in suits. We cleaned ourselves up as best we could, then ventured into the corridor. A soldier approached immediately. "Identification," he demanded. Before we could respond, a familiar voice called from down the hall. "They're with me." Captain Reeves strode toward us, his expression grim but relieved. "I was beginning to think you didn't make it out of Denver." He led us to a secure conference room where several officers and civilian officials were gathered around a table covered with maps and reports. A large screen showed satellite imagery of multiple cities, all with the same pattern of destruction we'd seen in Denver. "It's spreading," Reeves explained. "Chicago, Atlanta, Phoenix, Seattle. The containment protocols failed or were deliberately sabotaged. We're looking at a nationwide outbreak within days if we can't stop it." One of the civilians, an older man with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority, addressed me directly. "Captain Reeves says you have evidence about the origin of this outbreak. About Project Threshold." I removed the portable drive from my pocket and placed it on the table. Everything I could recover from the hospital administrative building. Research protocols, test results, subject records, it's all there. A technician connected the drive to a secure system, and the files appeared on the main screen. The room fell silent as the horrifying truth became clear. Project Threshold hadn't been just about creating controllable infected. It was about creating a specific type of controlled chaos that would justify emergency powers, allow certain agencies to operate without oversight, and eliminate political opposition through containment protocols. The civilian who had addressed me earlier stood up, face pale with anger. "This is a coup, a biological coup against the civilian government." "Worse than that, sir," another officer said. "According to these files, they lost control of the pathogen almost immediately. The behavioral control elements only work on about 20% of infected subjects. The rest are just what they appear to be: mindless, aggressive carriers spreading the infection without restraint. And now they're trying to cover it up," Marion added, "purging cities, eliminating witnesses, controlling the narrative." The room erupted in urgent discussion: deployment options, countermeasures, communication strategies. I sat back, exhausted from our ordeal, but relieved that the truth was finally reaching people who could act on it. Captain Reeves pulled me aside. "You've done your country a service today," he said quietly. "But you're still in danger. Threshold has operatives throughout the military and government. Until we identify and neutralize them all, you're a target." "What happens now?" I asked. "We secure this facility against potential internal threats. We distribute your evidence to trusted commanders nationwide, and we prepare to fight back against both the infected and those who created them." He handed me a secure tablet. "Review these files. They contain everything we know about the pathogen's weaknesses, potential treatments, defensive strategies. Your engineering background gives you a unique perspective. You see systems, connections that others might miss." I accepted the tablet, scrolling through complex diagrams and technical specifications. Some of this looks like infrastructure modifications, containment systems, emergency power, water purification. Reeves nodded. "If we can't stop the spread immediately, we need to establish secure zones, places where survivors can rebuild while we develop a more permanent solution. Your skills would be invaluable for that effort." For the first time since the outbreak began, I felt a sense of purpose beyond mere survival. My technical knowledge, the ability to understand and maintain the system civilization depends on, was exactly what would be needed if society were to rebuild from this catastrophe. As I studied the files, I noticed something curious. references to electronic frequencies that could disrupt the pathogen's neural effects. The control mechanism Threshold had engineered into the virus had a vulnerability. With the right broadcast equipment, we might be able to prevent the infected from responding to Threshold's control signals. I showed the information to Reeves. This could explain what happened at the hospital complex, why the infected suddenly stopped following orders and attacked everyone. He studied the data. If we could reproduce that effect on a larger scale, we could prevent Threshold from using the infected as a controlled force. They'd just be standard zombies, dangerous but predictable. I could build a transmitter, I said, mind already working through the technical requirements, modify existing broadcast equipment to generate the right frequencies. Reeves clapped my shoulder. Get whatever you need. This could be the edge we need. As I began listing equipment and components, an alarm sounded throughout the facility. The security officer at the door received a message through his headset, then turned to the room with a grim expression. Perimeter breach. Multiple points. We have infected inside the base. Reeves immediately took command. Secure all entrances to this building. Implement protocol firewall. Sir, the communications officer interrupted. We're receiving reports that the infected are moving with coordination. They're bypassing standard barriers and targeting command facilities specifically. Someone had turned the infected against us, using the very control system we'd just been discussing. Threshold was making its move, using their biological weapons to eliminate opposition within the military. How long can we hold this position? The civilian authority asked. Reeves checked the security feeds showing infected swarming across the base. Hours at most. We need to evacuate key personnel and evidence to the backup facility. He turned to me. The transmitter you mentioned. Can you build a prototype quickly? Something portable? I assessed the equipment available in the command center. Give me an hour and some basic components. It won't have much range, but it might disrupt control signals within a few hundred yards. Do it, he ordered. If we can break Threshold's control over the infected even temporarily, we might have a fighting chance. As the others prepared evacuation protocols and defensive positions, I set to work with the tools and components they gathered for me. This was what I did best: understanding systems, solving technical problems, building solutions from available parts. The infected were inside the base perimeter, deliberately targeting our command structure, but if my improvised transmitter worked, we might turn Threshold's weapon against them, break their control over the horde, create enough chaos to escape with the evidence. Day 6 of the apocalypse was reaching its climax. Whether we survived to see Day 7 would depend on my ability to engineer a solution against impossible odds. But for the first time, I wasn't alone in the fight, and that made all the difference. I built the signal disruptor from components scavenged from the command center's communication equipment. The theory was sound. The Project Threshold files showed that the pathogen responded to specific frequency patterns that mimicked certain neural activities. By generating an interfering signal, we might be able to block the control mechanism, leaving the infected in their base feral state. My hands worked with practiced precision despite the chaos around us. Soldiers barricaded doors and windows. Officers coordinated evacuation plans. Medical personnel prepared emergency supplies. Everyone had a role, a purpose, a function in the system, just like the components I was assembling. 3 minutes to breach, someone called out as I made the final connections on my improvised device. Is it ready? Reeves asked, appearing at my side. I nodded, connecting the power supply, a modified radio battery pack. Untested and limited range, but the principle is sound. It should disrupt their control signals within about 200 yards. Good enough to clear an evacuation route, he decided. We have 3 vehicles prepped in the underground garage. Our priority is getting that evidence to secure servers outside Threshold's reach. The security feeds showed the approaching horde. Unlike the mindless infected I'd encountered in Denver, these moved with military precision, maintaining formation, using cover, focusing on strategic entry points. Someone was directing them with tactical expertise, using them as soldiers rather than just weapons. We moved toward the evacuation point, my disruptor emitting its silent frequency. Would it work, or had I misunderstood some critical component of the control system? We'd know soon enough. The underground garage was our last hope, 3 armored vehicles waiting to break out through the service tunnel. As we descended the final stairwell, we heard them, the shuffling footsteps and inhuman groans of the infected, already inside the garage. I activated the disruptor at full power. For several heartbeats, nothing happened. Then came a shift, subtle at first, then unmistakable. The coordinated movements of the infected broke down. They stopped responding to whatever commands they were receiving and reverted to their base instincts, aggressive but directionless. "It's working," Marion whispered beside me. Reeves signaled the assault team, who moved forward with practiced efficiency, eliminating infected that blocked our path to the vehicles. We ran the final distance, piling into the armored transports as more infected poured into the garage from other access points. Our vehicle lurched forward, smashing through the disorganized infected as we entered the service tunnel. The other 2 vehicles followed close behind, forming a protective convoy. The narrow tunnel provided temporary safety, but what waited at the other end was unknown. "Where are we going?" I asked Reeves, who was coordinating with other units via secure radio. "Secondary facility in the mountains. Hardened bunker designed to survive nuclear strikes. If anywhere can hold against both the infected and threshold, it's there." The tunnel ended at a security checkpoint which raised its barriers as we approached. Beyond lay open terrain, rolling hills leading toward the distant Rockies. But between us and safety were multiple roadblocks, some military, some improvised by survivors, some formed by abandoned vehicles. Our small convoy navigated the obstacles as best we could, sometimes forcing a path through, other times finding alternate routes. The disruptor continued functioning, creating a bubble of confusion among any infected we encountered. They would attack, but without coordination, without strategy, making them dangerous but manageable. We had been driving for nearly an hour when Reeves received a transmission that changed everything. His expression darkened as he listened. Then he turned to address all of us in the vehicle. "Threshold has activated some kind of fail-safe protocol. Reports are coming in from all quarantine zones. The infected are exhibiting new behaviors, new capabilities. The pathogen is evolving, adapting to overcome resistance." As if to confirm his words, we crested a hill and saw what waited in the valley below. A massive gathering of infected, hundreds, perhaps thousands, but they weren't mindless or disorganized. Even from a distance, I could see they were building something, working together, using tools. My disruptor's light flickered, then went dark. The battery was failing, but I suspected that wasn't the only problem. The control system had adapted, changing frequencies, evolving beyond my crude countermeasure. "We need to go around," I said, pointing to a forest road visible on our maps. Reeves shook his head. "No time. Reports indicate similar gatherings forming at all major roadways. They're establishing a perimeter, cutting off escape routes to the bunker." Looking at the infected horde below, I realized we were witnessing the next phase of whatever Threshold had planned. Not just a weapon, not just a coup, but something more fundamental, a forced evolution of humanity itself. "We fight through," Reeves decided. "Full speed, no stops. The lead vehicle will clear a path, the others follow directly behind." As our convoy accelerated down the hillside toward the gathered infected, I clutched the evidence we'd recovered and made a silent promise. If we survived, if we reached safety, I would use everything I'd learned, every skill, every insight, every scrap of technical knowledge to help rebuild from this catastrophe. The seventh day was dawning. A new world was being born in blood and chaos, and somehow, against all odds, I was still alive to witness it.